Jack Carter had always been more than just a cop. He was a protector, a man who lived by a strict moral code. But his greatest responsibility wasn't to the city he served. It was to his younger sister, Julie. Their parents had died in a car crash when Julie was just 12. And from that moment on, Jack became everything to her. Her brother, her guardian, and the only family she had left. He was only 18 at the time, barely an adult himself, but he never hesitated. He worked extra shifts, put aside his personal life, and did everything he could to make sure she never felt alone. Even on the toughest days, when the weight of the world pressed on his shoulders, he found strength in knowing he was keeping Julie safe. She was his priority, his purpose. Raising Julie wasn't easy. Jack wasn't just a brother. He had to be a father figure, a role model, and a disciplinarian. He learned to cook, attended school meetings, and made sure she never lacked anything. He even turned down promotions at work because they would take him away from home too often. His social life became non-existent. Relationships never lasted because he always put Julie first. Friends told him he was too protective, but he didn't care. His sister was all that mattered. He had made a promise to their parents, and he intended to keep it. No matter how exhausted he was, no matter how much he had to sacrifice, he never regretted it. As Julie grew older, she started to push boundaries. She wasn't disrespectful, but she had a rebellious streak that Jack found difficult to control. At 16, she started staying out late, making new friends Jack didn't trust. He tried to warn her, to guide her, but she was stubborn. She craved independence, eager to experience the world on her own terms. Jack, however, wasn't ready to loosen his grip. He knew how dangerous the world could be, and he refused to let her walk into trouble. Their arguments became frequent, but no matter how tense things got, he always forgave her. She was his baby sister, the only family he had left. When Julie turned 18, everything shifted. At first, it was subtle. Small changes in her appearance, the way she dressed, the way she spoke. She became more secretive, spending time with people Jack didn't know. But what Jack didn't realize was that Julie's curiosity had taken a dark turn. She had grown up surrounded by Jack's friends, strong, confident men who exuded authority. To her, they weren't just his colleagues. They were intriguing, experienced, and forbidden. She started to see them differently, not as her brother's friends, but as something more. Julie had always been drawn to the idea of danger, of stepping beyond the lines of what was acceptable. And now, as an adult, she felt the power of her own allure. She tested the waters, harmless teasing, lingering touches, playful smirks. Jack's friends dismissed it at first, thinking it was just youthful playfulness. But Julie wasn't playing. She wanted more. She wanted to feel wanted, to see how far she could push the limits before someone broke. What started as innocent curiosity quickly spiraled into something much more dangerous, something that would change everything forever. Jack started noticing the change in Julie, but he convinced himself it was just a phase. She was young, testing boundaries, nothing unusual, but deep down, something felt off. He saw the way she interacted with his friends, the way she held eye contact for a second too long, how her laughter seemed just a little too inviting. At first, he dismissed it, blaming it on his own overprotectiveness. But then, he caught her one night, whispering on the phone, her voice low, playful, and undeniably flirtatious. When he confronted her, she brushed him off, laughing at his concern. "I'm not a little girl anymore, Jack," she said, her tone both teasing and defiant. That was the moment he realized he might be losing control. Julie knew she was walking on thin ice, but she didn't care. She had spent her entire life under Jack's watchful eye, always being told what to do, who to trust, and what was safe. But she wanted more. She wanted to step into the world on her own terms, and if that meant getting close to the very men Jack trusted, then so be it. One of them, in particular, caught her attention. Daniel, Jack's closest friend and longtime partner in the force. He was older, experienced, and had the kind of quiet confidence that made her pulse race. She tested him, pushing the limits with every interaction. A lingering touch here, a suggestive comment there. He resisted at first, knowing it was a dangerous line to cross. But Julie was persistent, and temptation had a way of breaking even the strongest of men. Jack had no idea how deep things had gone until one night, when he walked in on something he never should have seen. He had come home late, exhausted from work, only to find Julie sitting too close to Daniel, their conversation low and intimate. The look in her eyes, the tension in Daniel's posture, it was enough to make Jack's blood run cold. His mind raced with questions, but anger overtook him before logic could. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice was sharp, demanding, cutting through the air like a blade. Julie met his gaze with a smirk, unbothered, as if daring him to acknowledge what was happening. Daniel, on the other hand, looked guilty. Too guilty. Jack knew then that something had changed, something irreversible. The one thing he feared most had become a reality, and there was no turning back. Jack Carter had always prided himself on his control, his ability to suppress emotions, think clearly, and never let rage dictate his actions. As a police officer, he had faced countless criminals, witnessed the worst of humanity, yet had never allowed himself to be consumed by hatred. But that night, everything he believed in shattered the moment he pushed open Julie's bedroom door. The sight before him was a grotesque nightmare brought to life. His 18-year-old sister, his baby sister, was tangled in a mass of naked limbs, surrounded by 7 men he had once called his brothers. The room reeked of sweat, alcohol, and something far more putrid, the stench of betrayal. For a moment, silence engulfed the space. Every pair of eyes turned toward Jack, frozen in horror. Julie gasped, scrambling to pull the covers over herself, her face paling as reality crashed down on her. The men, equally stunned, barely had time to register the danger standing before them. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps, his fingers twitching toward the gun holstered at his side. His mind struggled to process the magnitude of what he was witnessing. These were the men he had trusted, the men who had laughed with him, shared drinks with him, had been to his house dozens of times before. And yet, here they were, violating the one person he had sworn to protect above all else. Miguel, always the boldest of the group, was the first to find his voice. He raised his hands in a feeble attempt at diplomacy. "Jack, listen, man." Bang. The first bullet ripped through Miguel's chest before he could finish his sentence. His body jerked backward, slamming onto the bed. Julie screamed, but Jack barely heard her. Chaos erupted. The men scrambled, naked and desperate, tripping over each other in a frenzied attempt to escape. But Jack was faster. His rage had transformed him into something primal, something merciless. Bang! Bang! David collapsed, clutching his stomach, blood pooling beneath him. Luis barely had time to turn before another bullet caught him in the throat. A strangled gurgle left his lips before he fell lifelessly to the floor. One of them lunged at Jack in a desperate bid for survival, a mistake. Without hesitation, Jack raised the gun and fired point blank into Paul's forehead. The explosion of blood and bones splattered against the walls, painting the room in horror. Julie sobbed, her body shaking uncontrollably as she huddled in the corner. But Jack was blind to her cries. He stepped over the corpses, moving toward the hallway where the remaining men were fleeing. Bang! Brian, who had almost reached the stairs, collapsed as the bullet tore through his back. His body tumbled down, landing in a heap at the bottom. Eric, injured but still moving, whimpered as he crawled toward the door. Jack followed, his expression eerily calm. He aimed downward. "Jack, please." Eric's voice was barely a whisper. Bang! Jack turned toward the last man, Tom, who had already made it outside, sprinting barefoot down the driveway. The cop inside him whispered that this was the moment to stop, to let him go, to call the authorities. But the brother inside him, the betrayed, broken brother, had already made his decision. Bang! Tom's body crumpled to the pavement. Silence. The only sound left was Julie sobbing, a pitiful noise that barely registered in Jack's ears. He turned, stepping back inside, his boots squelching against the blood-soaked carpet. Julie looked up at him, her tear-streaked face contorted in devastation. "I never saw you like this," she whispered, voice trembling. Jack stared at her, emotionless. "I loved you more than anything." Her lips trembled. I couldn't control it. I had cravings, dark fantasies." Disgust twisted Jack's face. "And you thought that was more important than me?" She shook her head frantically, her tears mixing with the blood on the floor. "I never meant to hurt you. I didn't think about what it would do to you." Jack let out a bitter laugh. "No, you didn't." Then, sirens. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the house, casting eerie shadows over the massacre Jack had created. The neighbors had heard the gunshots. Within seconds, officers burst through the door, their weapons drawn. Jack exhaled slowly, dropping his gun. He didn't fight when they tackled him to the ground. As the cold steel of handcuffs bit into his wrists, he turned to Julie one last time. "Learn from your mistakes," he murmured, "and live." Jack sat in the back of the police car, his wrists tightly bound, his expression unreadable. The flashing lights reflected off his face, casting sharp shadows across his features. He didn't resist, didn't plead his case. He simply stared ahead, numb. Outside, officers moved in and out of his house, their faces pale as they surveyed the carnage. 7 bodies, 7 men who had once been his friends. Julie was outside, wrapped in a blanket, trembling as an officer spoke to her in hushed tones. She kept glancing toward the police car, her eyes pleading, but Jack refused to meet her gaze. The ride to the station was silent. The officers driving him were men he had worked with for years, men who had respected him. Now they wouldn't even look at him. When they arrived, the precinct fell into stunned silence. Jack Carter, the honest cop, the man with an unshakable moral compass, was now a murderer. They placed him in an interrogation room, his hands still cuffed. Hours passed before the door creaked open, and Detective Marcus Reynolds stepped inside. Reynolds was a grizzled man in his 50s, someone Jack had once admired, a mentor, a friend. He sat down, exhaling heavily. "I want to believe this isn't what it looks like." Jack didn't answer. Reynolds leaned forward. 7 bodies, Jack. 7. That's not justice. That's a bloodbath." Jack clenched his jaw. "They took everything from me." Reynolds sighed, pulling out crime scene photos. The images were brutal. Blood, corpses, Julie sobbing on the floor. "You're a cop. You know how this works. The evidence is overwhelming. Your prints are on the gun. You confessed. There's no getting out of this." Jack nodded. "I know. The DA is already involved. This is going to trial. The media is going to eat this up. Hero cop turns killer." Jack remained silent. Reynolds hesitated before asking, "And Julie?" Jack's fingers tightened into fists. His voice was cold. "She's the only one left." Reynolds studied him. "Do you blame her?" Jack exhaled sharply, his shoulders rigid. "Yes. But you still love her." Jack's expression darkened. "Yes." Reynolds shook his head. "That's the tragedy of it, isn't it?" Jack didn't respond. The courtroom was packed. Reporters whispered. Cameras flashed. The nation was captivated by the story of Jack Carter, the executioner cop. Julie sat in the front row, hands folded in her lap. She looked different now, thinner, paler. The guilt had aged her. The prosecution painted Jack as a monster, a man who had let rage consume him. The defense argued temporary insanity, but Jack never denied what he had done. Julie took the stand. When asked if she felt responsible, she didn't hesitate. "Yes." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. "I was selfish. I didn't think about what I was doing, and now I've lost him forever." Jack finally looked at her. Their eyes met. For the first time since the massacre, Julie saw something in his gaze that shattered her completely. Nothing. No anger. No sorrow. Just emptiness. The verdict was inevitable. Life in prison without parole. Jack took it without reaction. As he was led away, Julie sobbed into her hands. But he didn't turn back. Prison was a different world. As a former cop, Jack was a target. But fear had died in him that night. He adapted quickly. Within a year, he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. Julie visited often, desperate for some form of forgiveness. One day, she whispered, "I miss you." Jack stared at her. "You should." Tears welled in her eyes. "You saved me." Jack looked away. "It doesn't change anything." "No," she admitted, "but it means something. And maybe, in another lifetime, that would have been enough." Jack Carter's trial had become a media spectacle, drawing the attention of the entire nation. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal analysts, and civilians who wanted to witness the downfall of a man who had once been a respected cop, but had now become a cold-blooded killer in their eyes. Cameras flashed as Jack was led inside in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists bound in handcuffs, his expression unreadable. Despite the weight of the world pressing down on him, he walked with a calmness that unnerved even the most seasoned officers in the room. Julie sat in the front row, her hands clenched together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had been called to testify, and she knew her words could influence the outcome of the trial. But what could she say? That her brother had saved her? That she had been the one who had set everything in motion? No one would understand. No one would see beyond the blood and the bodies. The prosecution wasted no time in painting Jack as a violent man who had taken the law into his own hands. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-witted attorney named Linda Graves, stood before the jury, her voice crisp and cutting. Jack Carter was not a man seeking justice. He was a man blinded by rage who massacred 7 people in cold blood. He didn't arrest them. He didn't seek legal action. He executed them. She let the words hang in the air before continuing. This was not the act of a grieving brother. This was the act of a murderer. Jack remained silent, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. He had no defense, no justification that would ever make sense to the world. He had done what he felt was necessary. That was all. The defense, however, took a different approach. Jack's lawyer, Raymond Connors, was an experienced attorney who had built his reputation on difficult cases. He knew that painting Jack as a hero wouldn't work in court. So instead, he leaned into the emotional devastation that had driven Jack to commit the murders. "Yes, my client killed those men," Connors admitted without hesitation. "But let's not pretend that those men were innocent. They betrayed him in the worst way possible. They violated the one person he loved more than anything." In that moment, Jack wasn't a cop. He was a brother who had just walked into a nightmare. He turned to the jury, his expression solemn. "Can anyone here say they wouldn't have reacted the same way?" There was a tense silence in the room. The jurors shifted uncomfortably. That was the question, wasn't it? When Julie was called to the stand, she felt like she was being suffocated. Every step she took toward the witness chair felt heavier than the last. She avoided looking at Jack, knowing that if she did, she might break down completely. The courtroom fell silent as she was sworn in, her trembling hands resting in her lap. "Julie Carter," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court what your relationship is to the defendant?" Julie swallowed hard. "He's my brother." "And before the events of that night, how would you describe your relationship with him?" Julie hesitated. He was everything to me. He raised me after our parents died. He worked day and night to make sure I had a normal life. He gave up so much for me." The prosecutor nodded. "And yet, despite all of that, you chose to betray him, didn't you?" A sharp murmur rippled through the courtroom. Julie's eyes widened. Objection," Connors interrupted. "Leading the witness." "Sustained," the judge said. The prosecutor adjusted her stance. "Let me rephrase. Julie, did you ever consider how your actions would affect your brother?" Tears welled up in Julie's eyes. "No," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I wasn't thinking about him. I wasn't thinking about anyone but myself." "And do you regret what you did?" Julie turned toward Jack for the first time. He was looking at her now, his expression blank, but his eyes holding something unspoken. "I regret it more than anything," she said, her voice breaking. "I ruined him." The prosecutor nodded as if she had expected that answer. She turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, there is no doubt that Julie Carter's actions were irresponsible, but Jack Carter's response was beyond excessive. 7 lives were lost in a matter of minutes. This was not self-defense. This was not justice. This was a massacre." Julie clenched her fists. She wanted to scream that those men had deserved it, that they had betrayed her brother in a way that no one could ever forgive. But she couldn't. She had already done enough damage. The trial lasted weeks, with legal experts debating every aspect of the case. Was Jack justified in what he did? Did his history as a cop make his actions more damning or more understandable? The public was divided. Some saw him as a fallen hero, while others saw him as a dangerous vigilante. When the jury finally returned with a verdict, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. Jack stood, his hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable. Julie couldn't breathe. The foreman cleared his throat and read the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jack Carter, guilty of all charges." A gasp spread through the room. Julie felt her heart shatter. She had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. Jack's sentence was immediate. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jack simply nodded, as if he had expected nothing else. The bailiffs moved to take him away, but before they could, he turned to Julie. Their eyes met one last time. "Live," he told her. "Don't waste it." Then he was gone. Julie broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. She had lost him forever. The media storm that followed was relentless. News stations debated whether Jack was a hero or a monster. Social media exploded with discussions about morality, justice, and revenge. But for Julie, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was that her brother was gone. But she wasn't going to let his sacrifice be for nothing. Julie dedicated herself to change. She threw herself into work, volunteering for organizations that helped troubled youth, speaking to young girls about the consequences of reckless decisions. She refused to let Jack's actions be in vain. She visited him in prison, but he never spoke much. He listened to her talk about her life, about how she was trying to be better, but he never gave her what she truly wanted, his forgiveness. Years passed, and Julie never stopped visiting. She never stopped hoping that one day he would say something that would tell her he didn't completely hate her. And then, on one visit, as she prepared to leave, she heard his voice. "Keep going." It was the first thing he had said to her in years. Julie turned, her eyes wide. Jack was looking at her, his expression softer than before. It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. Jack Carter adjusted to life in prison with the same quiet resilience that had carried him through years as a detective. He didn't complain, didn't cause trouble, and didn't speak unless absolutely necessary. His reputation had preceded him, both as a former cop and as a man who had executed 7 criminals without hesitation. This dual identity made him both respected and feared among the inmates. Some prisoners saw him as a legend, a man who had done what the law couldn't. Others, particularly those who had suffered at the hands of the police, saw him as an enemy. It wasn't long before the tension boiled over. One night, as Jack was returning from the prison library, a group of men cornered him near his cell. They were gang members, their eyes gleaming with hostility. Jack knew what was coming. The leader, a wiry man with tattoos covering his neck, stepped forward. "You think you're untouchable, cop?" Jack didn't respond. He had no interest in engaging, but he also knew that silence wouldn't stop what was about to happen. The first punch landed in his stomach, forcing the air from his lungs. Another struck his ribs. Jack staggered but didn't fall. He had been in worse situations. He fought back, knocking one of his attackers to the ground with a single blow, but there were too many of them. By the time the guards arrived, Jack was lying in a pool of his own blood. He spent 3 days in the infirmary, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was what the rest of his life would be: violence and survival. But then something unexpected happened. A man approached his bedside, an older inmate with gray hair and piercing blue eyes. His name was Victor Hayes, a former military strategist serving life for war crimes. He wasn't a friend, but he wasn't an enemy either. "You're making enemies too fast," Victor said, sitting down beside Jack's bed. "You're a lone wolf, Carter. That doesn't work in here." Jack didn't reply. He had no interest in alliances, but Victor wasn't finished. "You want to survive? You need to be useful. People don't attack assets. They protect them," Jack scoffed. "And what do you suggest? That I join a gang?" Victor smirked. "No, I suggest you become a ghost, invisible, too valuable to kill, too dangerous to provoke." Jack didn't respond, but the words lingered. He needed to adapt. And he would. Outside the prison walls, Julie Carter was not resting. The guilt of what had happened weighed on her every day. She had destroyed Jack's life, and she wasn't going to let his sacrifice be for nothing. She had spent months researching legal loopholes, searching for a way to get his sentence reduced. She reached out to lawyers, human rights organizations, and even journalists who had followed Jack's case. Most turned her away. Jack's crimes were too severe, too public. But one person listened, a young, ambitious attorney named Daniel Reeves. Daniel was known for taking impossible cases, and Julie's plea intrigued him. He reviewed Jack's trial, combing through every detail. "There's something here," Daniel told her one evening. "The prosecution built their case on emotion. They framed Jack as a monster, but they ignored the psychology of the moment." Julie leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Daniel adjusted his glasses. "You said Jack walked in and saw those men laughing after what they did to you?" Julie nodded, her throat tightening at the memory. Daniel tapped his pen against the table. "That's trauma-induced temporary insanity. He didn't plan to kill them. He reacted. If we can prove that, we can appeal." Hope flickered in Julie's chest for the first time in years. Back in prison, Jack had taken Victor's advice. He kept his head down, stayed out of unnecessary fights, and built a reputation as someone who could be useful. He offered advice to inmates who needed help navigating the prison system. He fixed things, radios, books, even injuries when fights broke out. But not everyone was willing to let him disappear. One night, he found a note under his pillow. "You should have died that night. We'll make sure it happens soon." Jack burned the note without hesitation. He had expected this. He had made too many enemies outside of prison, and some of them had connections inside. He prepared himself. He worked out relentlessly, sharpening his body into a weapon. He memorized guard patterns, learned every blind spot in the prison. If someone was coming for him, he wouldn't be an easy target. And then, one evening, they came. 3 men, armed with makeshift knives. Jack fought like a man with nothing to lose. He broke one attacker's arm, slammed another's head against the concrete, and barely avoided a blade aimed at his throat. The guards arrived too late. Jack was bleeding, but the 3 attackers were in worse shape. He was sent to solitary confinement, but that didn't bother him. He had sent a message. He wasn't going down without a fight. Meanwhile, Julie and Daniel had built a solid case for Jack's appeal. They presented evidence of Jack's psychological state, arguing that his actions were a result of extreme trauma rather than premeditated murder. The appeal hearing was intense. The prosecution fought hard, refusing to paint Jack as anything but a killer. But Daniel was relentless. He called in experts, psychologists who testified that Jack had suffered a severe mental break. He brought in former officers who spoke about Jack's integrity before the incident. And finally, Julie took the stand again. This time, not as a broken woman, but as a determined sister fighting for justice. "Jack didn't just lose control," she said. "He lost himself, and it was my fault." The court was silent as she spoke, her voice raw with emotion. "If you had seen what I saw that night, if you had felt what he felt, you wouldn't be asking whether he deserved to be locked away forever. You'd be asking how he managed to survive it all." The ruling took weeks. Jack sat in his cell, refusing to hope. He had already accepted his fate. But then, the day came. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom. This court finds sufficient grounds for an appeal. The previous ruling of life without parole is overturned. The defendant's sentence is reduced to 15 years, with eligibility for parole in 5. Julie sobbed. Jack sat frozen, his hands clenched. It wasn't complete freedom, but it was a chance. A chance to see the outside world again, a chance to start over. As he was led out of the courtroom, Julie ran to him, wrapping her arms around him. For the first time in years, Jack allowed himself to feel something other than anger. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a life waiting for him beyond those prison walls.